My name is Arthur. A few years back, I sat in a stuffy lawyer's office, smelling of old paper and furniture polish, and listened as my own family laughed at me. The lawyer had just finished reading my grandfather's will, and my inheritance, the only thing he left me, was an old, abandoned cabin up on Shadow Mountain. My cousin Mark, a man who builds cheap houses on postage-stamped lots and calls himself a developer, leaned over and patted my shoulder. "Enjoy your kingdom of termites, Arthur," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The room filled with snickers. That single sentence felt like a hammer blow, not to my pride, but to something deeper, something connected to the memory of my grandfather. It was a moment of pure, undiluted humiliation. What would you do if your own family laughed at you for inheriting a ruin? Listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The lawyer's office was small, paneled in dark wood that seemed to soak up all the light. I remember looking down at my hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of working with stone, resting on my worn denim pants. Then I looked at Mark and his sister, Sarah. They were dressed in sharp, expensive clothes that looked out of place in our small town. Their smiles were tight and condescending, the kind people use when they feel sorry for you, but also think you deserve it. They had already received their inheritances, sensible things, like stocks and parcels of land that could be easily sold. Mine was the punchline to a joke they'd been telling their whole lives, the story of their simple, dirt-poor cousin who never amounted to anything. The cabin was just the final, perfect confirmation of that story in their eyes. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden, a symbol of a life they felt was wasted. And they couldn't have been more delighted to see it land on me. The phrase, "kingdom of termites," echoed in my head long after the snickering died down. It was a cruel, carefully chosen barb. Mark knew I'd spent my life building things to last. Stone hearths, solid foundations, walls that would stand for a century. He knew my work was my dignity. To hand me a collapsing wreck and call it a kingdom was to mock the very core of who I was. The other relatives in the room, people I'd known my whole life, either looked away or offered weak, pitying smiles. No one spoke up. The silence of the decent ones was almost as loud as the laughter of the cruel ones. In that moment I felt an isolation so profound, it was like the room had gone cold. I was an outcast in my own family, judged and dismissed not for anything I'd done, but for what I didn't have. The cabin wasn't the issue. My entire life was on trial, and they had delivered their verdict with a sneer. I didn't fight back. I didn't raise my voice or try to defend myself. Years of hard labor teach you a certain kind of patience, a stoicism that anger can't easily break. I just gave a slow nod, my face set like a stone, even as shame burned hot in my chest. I watched the lawyer, a man named Henderson, who had known my grandfather for 50 years, slide the old, rusted key and the folded deed across the polished table. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. He just pushed the papers forward, eager to be done with the uncomfortable business. I reached out, my thick fingers closing around that cold piece of metal. It felt heavy, not just with its own weight, but with the weight of my family's scorn. Taking that key was an act of acceptance, but not of their judgment. It was an acceptance of the path my grandfather had laid out for me, even if I couldn't yet see where it was leading. Leaving that office felt like stepping out of a tomb. The fresh air hit me, but it didn't clear my head. The short walk to my old pickup truck was the longest I'd ever taken. I could feel their eyes on my back from the window, watching the old stonemason shuffle off to his worthless inheritance. I got in the truck and just sat there for a long time, the key clutched in my fist. The ridges of the key pressed into my palm, a sharp and real sensation in a world that had suddenly felt flimsy and cruel. That wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a severance. They had made it clear where I stood, and as I finally turned the ignition, the old engine rumbling to life, I made a silent promise. Not to them, and not even to myself, It was a promise to my grandfather. I would not let his legacy, whatever it was, be defined by their laughter. The kingdom of termites was mine now, and I was going to see what secrets its crumbling walls were keeping. My life wasn't built on stock portfolios or land deals like Mark's. It was built on stone and sweat. I was born right here in Stone Creek, in a small house my father built with his own 2 hands, wood he cut himself. My earliest memories are of the smell of sawdust and the feel of rough-hewn timber. We didn't have much, but we had solid walls and a roof that didn't leak. My father was a carpenter, and he taught me that a man's worth is measured by the quality of his work, not the size of his bank account. He'd say, "Arthur, build it to last. Don't cut corners. Your name is on every nail you drive, every stone you set." That lesson stuck with me deeper than any schoolbook learning ever could. It became the foundation of my entire life, the bedrock on which everything else was built. I found my calling not with wood, but with stone. There was something about it that spoke to me. Its permanence, its honesty. A stone doesn't lie. It is what it is. I started as a laborer, mixing mortar for Old Man Hemlock, the best stonemason in 3 counties. My hands were raw and blistered for years. My back ached every single night. But I learned. I watched how he chose each stone, how he felt its weight and shape, seeing where it would fit before he even lifted it. He taught me how to read the grain of a rock like it was a page in a book. It wasn't just a job. It was a craft, an art form passed down through generations. I took pride in building chimneys that drew perfectly, and foundations that would never shift, knowing that a family would be safe and warm because of my labor. It was on one of those jobs, building a hearth for the new doctor's house, that I met Eleanor. She was the doctor's niece, visiting for the summer. She'd bring me lemonade and sit on a stack of lumber, just watching me work. She didn't see a dirty laborer. She saw the focus, the care I put into my craft. She'd ask questions about the different kinds of stone, about the way I mixed the mortar. Her curiosity was genuine. She had this quiet strength about her, a kindness in her eyes that could make a man feel 10 feet tall. We started talking, then walking by the creek in the evenings. By the end of that summer, I knew I couldn't live without her. I was just a poor stonemason, but I promised her a home as solid as the mountains around us. We married the following spring. I didn't have money for a fancy house, so I bought a small plot of land with every cent I had saved. For 2 years, I worked on other people's homes during the day and on our own in the evenings and on weekends, until my hands were numb. Eleanor was right there with me, holding lanterns, bringing me food, and telling me I was the strongest man she'd ever known. I built our home stone by stone, a small, sturdy cottage with a hearth so big it took me a month to finish. The night we finally lit a fire in it, we just sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance. She put her head on my shoulder and whispered, "This is our kingdom, Arthur, built to last." Her words were the opposite of Mark's. They were a balm to my soul, a testament to what we had built together from nothing. Our life was simple, but it was good. We never had much money, but we had each other. We had a garden out back, a roof that never leaked, and a fire to keep us warm. I remember the small victories more than anything. The year I finally saved enough to buy my first pickup truck, a used Ford that sputtered and coughed, but ran like a dream to me. Or the time I re-roofed the old community church after a storm, and the whole congregation brought us food for a week. These were the things that mattered. They were tangible signs of a life well lived, a life of purpose. Eleanor used to say that we were rich in ways my cousins would never understand. She was right. Their wealth was cold, printed on paper. Ours was in the warmth of our hearth and the strength of our bond. Then my parents got older, and their health started to fail. My father's hands, once so strong, became gnarled with arthritis. My mother's memory started to fade. I was their only son who stayed in Stone Creek. My sisters had moved away, and my cousins, well, they were busy building their fortunes, so the responsibility fell to me. I put my dream of starting my own small masonry business on the back burner. I took fewer jobs so I could be there for them, fixing their leaky faucets, driving them to doctor's appointments, just sitting with them on their porch. It was a sacrifice, sure, but it wasn't a choice. It was just what you do for family. You show up. You put their needs before your own. Eleanor supported me every step of the way, never once complaining that we had less because of it. After my parents passed, we had a few good years, just the two of us again. We talked about traveling a little, maybe seeing the ocean one day. But life has a way of throwing rocks in your path when you least expect it. Eleanor got sick. It started slowly, a tiredness she couldn't shake, and then it grew into something fierce and unyielding. The doctors gave us a name for it, a long, complicated word that meant our time together was running out. My work became secondary. My world shrank to the size of our little stone cottage, to her bedside. All those years I'd spent building things to protect people from the elements, and now I couldn't protect the one person who meant everything to me from the storm raging inside her. It was a helpless feeling, the kind that grinds a man down to his very foundations. For 5 years, I was her caregiver. I learned to cook, to clean, to administer her medicine. My hands, which were used to the rough texture of stone, learned the gentle art of care. Some days were better than others. On the good days, we'd sit by the window, and she'd tell me stories about her childhood. On the bad days, I'd just hold her hand, the silence in the room heavier than any stone I'd ever lifted. My cousin Mark called once during that time, not to ask how Eleanor was, but to see if I was interested in selling our land. He said he could get me a fair price. I told him my land wasn't for sale and hung up the phone. He never called again. That's the kind of man he is. He sees everything as a transaction, a number on a ledger. He can't comprehend a value that can't be counted in dollars. Eleanor passed away in the spring, 10 years ago now. The house fell silent after that. The silence was the hardest part. The fire in the hearth didn't seem as warm anymore. I threw myself back into my work, taking on any job I could find. The physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the hollowness inside me. I worked until my body screamed for rest, and then I'd come home to an empty house, eat a can of soup, and fall asleep in my chair. I was surviving, but I wasn't living. I was just a man going through the motions, setting one stone on top of another, because it was the only thing I knew how to do. The joy in the craft was gone. It was just labor now, a way to pass the long, empty days until the sun went down. It was during those lonely years that I first thought seriously about my grandfather's old cabin on Shadow Mountain. I had only been there once, as a little boy. My grandfather, a quiet man like me, had taken me up there on a crisp autumn afternoon. The road was barely a trail back then, and we had to walk the last half-mile. I remember the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The cabin looked ancient even then, like it had grown out of the mountain itself. But what I remember most vividly was the hearth. It was massive, built from huge river stones, each one perfectly fitted. My grandfather put his hand on it and said, "Your great-grandfather built this, Arthur, with his own hands. He was a stonemason, too. This hearth is the heart of this place. As long as it stands, this cabin will have a soul." That memory was a small, flickering candle in the darkness of my grief. My grandfather saw the same thing in me that I saw in the stone, a connection to the past, a respect for things that last. He wasn't a man of many words, but that day he told me stories about his father, about how he'd hauled those stones from the creek bed himself, using a mule and a sled. He said his father believed a man's legacy wasn't what he owned, but what he built. Looking back, I realized my grandfather was trying to pass something on to me, something more valuable than money. He was passing on a piece of our history, a piece of our family's soul. It was a lesson my cousins, with their eyes fixed on the future and their wallets, could never grasp. They saw a ruin. He wanted me to see a legacy. Over the years, the story of the cabin became a family joke, mostly told by Mark. He'd bring it up at Christmas or Thanksgiving, calling it Grandpa's Folly, or that pile of sticks up on the mountain. He'd laugh about how the old man held onto a worthless piece of property out of pure sentimentality. I never said anything. I just let him talk. Arguing with a man like Mark is like trying to reason with the wind. He only hears the sound of his own voice. But his words were like little chips of stone, breaking off pieces of that warm memory I held, trying to turn it into something to be ashamed of. He wanted to make me feel small for valuing something that couldn't be sold, something that had no obvious practical use in his world of profit margins and quick flips. My life has been a series of battles, most of them silent. I fought to learn a trade, I fought to build a home, I fought to care for my family, and I fought to survive my own grief. I never asked for help, and I never expected any. All I ever wanted was a little peace and the dignity of my own labor. I've lived by a simple code: be honest, work hard, and honor your promises. I promised Eleanor a home built to last, and I gave her one. I promised my parents I'd look after them, and I did. My hands are calloused, my back is bent, but my conscience is clear. I've never cheated anyone, and I've never taken a shortcut. That, to me, is a successful life. It's a kind of wealth Mark will never have, no matter how many cheap houses he builds. So when he called that cabin a kingdom of termites, it wasn't just an insult about a piece of property. It was an insult to my grandfather, to my great-grandfather, and to the very principles I've lived my entire life by. It was his way of saying that a life of hard, honest labor, of sacrifice and loyalty, amounted to nothing more than a pile of rotting wood. He was mocking a legacy of craftsmanship, a history written in stone, because he lacked the vision to see its worth. He couldn't understand that the value of some things isn't measured in their market price, but in the stories they hold and the hands that built them. He saw decay, but I remembered my grandfather's words about the cabin's soul, and that's why I took the key. In that moment, surrounded by their condescending smiles and whispered jokes, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. It wasn't about proving them wrong. Not really. It was about proving my grandfather right. It was about honoring the memory of the man who saw a fellow craftsman in his grandson. This wasn't just about inheriting an old cabin. It was about accepting a responsibility, a guardianship over the one thing our family had left that was built to last. The stones of that hearth had been waiting for a century, holding a story, and I, a stonemason with nothing left to lose, was the only one left who knew how to listen to them. My journey up to that mountain wasn't just a trip to inspect some property. It was a pilgrimage. I was going back to the source, to the heart of my family's true legacy. The laughter in that lawyer's office faded with every mile I put between myself and town. It was replaced by the rumble of my old truck's engine and the quiet hum of the forest. I wasn't just going to fix a building. I was going to reclaim a piece of my own history, a piece of my own soul that had been chipped away by grief and ridicule. They thought they were burdening me with a worthless ruin. They had no idea they were handing me the one thing that could save me, the one thing that could make my life whole again. They handed me a key to a pile of wood, but I knew it was the key to something much, much more. The laughter didn't stay in that lawyer's office. It followed me home, seeping into the cracks of my quiet life in Stone Creek like a winter draft. The first time I felt it, I was in Miller's General Store, picking up some bread and coffee. Martha Miller, whose porch I'd rebuilt a decade ago, gave me this look. It was a mix of pity and something else, something like embarrassment for me. She asked what I was up to, and when I said I was heading up to the old cabin to take a look, her smile tightened. "Oh, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a sad secret. "You be careful up there." It wasn't a warning about loose floorboards or a leaky roof. It was a warning about my own foolishness, a gentle suggestion that I was a man to be pitied, a man who had been handed a punchline and was treating it like a prize. The whole store seemed to go quiet, listening. It didn't take long for Mark's words to become the town's words. Kingdom of Termites became a piece of local folklore. I'd hear it muttered when I walked past the diner. Two fellas I'd known my whole life, Farmers who should have understood the value of holding on to what's yours were laughing about it on the courthouse steps. One of them slapped the other on the back and said, "Better check your barn for termites, Jed, or Arthur might try to claim it as a sister kingdom." Their laughter was loud and careless, not meant to be hidden. They wanted me to hear it. It was their way of putting me in my place, reminding me that in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, my inheritance had made me a public joke. My grandfather's legacy, my only inheritance, was now a running gag for men with nothing better to do than mock another's misfortune. Then came the avoidance. It was subtle at first, a slight turn of a head, a sudden interest in a storefront window as I walked by. But then it became obvious. I saw Jim Peterson, a man I'd shared a beer with 100 times at the VFW across the street. He saw me, I know he did. Our eyes met for a split second. Then he ducked his head and abruptly turned into the barber shop, a place I knew he hadn't been to in a month because his wife cut his hair. It was such a small thing, a man crossing the street to avoid a 2-minute conversation. But it felt like a door slamming shut. It was a clear message. You're not one of us right now. Your situation is uncomfortable, your folly is contagious, and we'd rather not be associated with it. That small act of social cowardice stung more than any loud joke. It was a quiet, deliberate shunning. The first drive up the mountain was a lonely one. The old logging road was more of a suggestion than a path, choked with weeds and littered with fallen branches that scraped the underside of my truck. As I got closer, the reality of the cabin hit me. It was worse than I remembered, worse than any joke could capture. The porch had completely collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and one wall was bowing out, threatening to give up the ghost entirely. I sat there in my truck for a long time just looking at it. Any sensible man would have seen what my family and the town saw: a lost cause, a money pit, a testament to failure. But as I looked at the ruin, a stubbornness I'd inherited from my father took root in my heart. This was mine, and no one was going to laugh it into the ground, not while I could still lift a hammer. My routine, the simple rhythm of my life, began to fray. I used to stop at the town diner every morning for a cup of coffee. I'd sit at the counter, and the waitress, Mary, would have it waiting for me. But after the will reading, things changed. When I walked in, the usual morning chatter would dip, just for a second, before picking up again, a little more forced. The men I used to talk with about the weather or the price of lumber would give me a short nod and turn back to their own conversations. I was no longer a part of the easy camaraderie of the place. I was an outsider in the one place I'd always belonged. I started taking my coffee to go. It was easier than sitting there in the growing silence, feeling the weight of their judgment as they watched me in the reflection of the countertop coffee machine. The offers of help were the cruelest part. They were always delivered with a smirk, a little nudge-nudge, wink-wink to whoever else was listening. Young Tom Caldwell, whose first fishing pole I had fixed when he was a boy, saw me loading some tools into my truck. He swaggered over, chewing on a toothpick. "Hey, Arthur," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "If you need a hand with the demolition, just let me know. I've got a buddy with a bulldozer who works cheap." He grinned, expecting a laugh. He got one from his friends lounging nearby. I just looked at him, at this boy I used to know, now a man, who thought humiliating an elder was a fine way to get a laugh. I didn't say a word. I just closed the tailgate of my truck with a loud, final clang and drove away, his friends, laughter echoing behind me. It was around that time the invitations stopped coming. I was never a big social man, but Eleanor and I had always been included in the town's little get-togethers. The annual church picnic, the 4th of July barbecue at the mayor's house, the potluck dinners at the community hall. These were the threads that wove our small town together. But that summer I heard about the picnic a week after it happened. I saw pictures of the barbecue on the front page of the local paper. No one had called, no one had stopped by. It was as if I had become invisible. They hadn't kicked me out of town. They had just erased me from the guest list. The isolation wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a fact. I was living in the same place, on the same streets, but I was no longer part of the community. I was just the old man on the edge of town with his ruin on the mountain. My cousin Sarah tried a different approach, one she probably thought was kind. She called me one evening, her voice dripping with a sweet, sticky concern that set my teeth on edge. "Arthur, honey, it's Sarah," she began. "Mark and I were just talking, and we're worried about you. Spending all your time up on that mountain, all alone. It's not healthy. That place holds bad memories." She paused, letting her fake sympathy hang in the air. "We found a man who would be willing to take the land off your hands, for a small price, of course, just to clear the debris. It would be a weight off your shoulders." A weight off my shoulders. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor, trying to save me from myself. She didn't see an inheritance or a legacy. She saw a mental problem, a sickness that needed to be cured by selling my history for scrap. I found myself thinking about Eleanor more and more during those days. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the ridges, and I could almost hear her voice. She would have known what to do. She would have faced them all with that quiet, unshakable dignity of hers. If someone had made a joke, she would have smiled and said something so sharp and witty it would have shut them up for a week. If a neighbor had snubbed us, she would have baked them a pie the next day, killing their malice with a kindness so pure it would have made them feel ashamed. She was my fortress, and without her I felt exposed. The whispers and the pitying looks were arrows, and I no longer had my shield. Her absence was a physical ache, a hollow space beside me where all that strength used to be. The whispers even started to affect my work, the one thing I still had. I went to give a quote for a new stone patio for the Henderson family, newcomers to the area. Mr. Henderson seemed impressed with my portfolio, but then he hesitated. "A friend of mine in town," he said, avoiding my eyes, "mentioned you might be preoccupied with a personal project, an old family property." He didn't have to say more. The gossip had reached him. The story of Arthur's folly was now a black mark on my professional reputation. The implication was clear. If a man was foolish enough to waste his time on a ruin, could he really be trusted to build something solid and new? I lost the job. It was the first time in 40 years that my name, my reputation for quality, wasn't good enough. They weren't just mocking my inheritance. They were trying to take away my livelihood. Even the children weren't immune. They soak up the attitudes of their parents like little sponges. I was walking past the schoolyard one afternoon and heard a group of them playing. One of the boys was pointing at an old, rickety-looking fort they had built from scrap wood. "This is Arthur's folly," he shouted, and all the kids laughed and pretended to be scared. "It's the kingdom of the termites. It's gonna fall down." It was a different kind of pain. They weren't being cruel, not intentionally. They were just playing, repeating a story they'd heard, a new local legend. But hearing my name, my family's story, turned into a playground taunt. It made me feel ancient and utterly alone. I had become a local boogeyman, a cautionary tale for children, the foolish old man who lived with ghosts and termites. There was a night, a few weeks into this ordeal, that I almost gave in. I had driven up to the cabin and just sat in my truck as darkness fell, the headlights cutting a weak path into the overgrown yard. The sheer scale of the work ahead, the weight of the town's scorn, the profound loneliness, it all crashed down on me at once. For a fleeting moment, I thought, they're right. What am I doing here? I'm an old man chasing a memory, trying to fix something that is broken beyond repair. Maybe I should just call Sarah, tell her to send her man with the bulldozer, and be done with it. The thought was a bitter poison. I turned off the engine and sat there in the complete darkness and silence of the mountain, feeling the foundations of my own resolve begin to crack under the strain. But then, as I stepped out of the truck, my flashlight beam cut across the base of the cabin. it landed on the foundation stones, and I saw it. Amidst the decay, the craftsmanship was still there. I ran my hand over a corner joint where two massive stones met. The seam was so tight, so perfect, you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. This was my great-grandfather's work. It was a signature, written in granite. He hadn't just stacked rocks. He had shaped them, fitted them, made them one. In that moment, I felt a connection, a conversation across a century of time. He was a stonemason. I am a stonemason. He built this to last. That single perfect joint was a silent rebuke to all the laughter, all the pity. It was the truth, solid and real, and it was all the encouragement I needed. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. From that day on, I worked. I didn't just visit the cabin, I inhabited it. I rose before the sun and drove my truck up that rough road every single day. I started by clearing the land around the cabin, hacking away years of tangled brush and thorny vines with an old scythe. It was brutal, back-breaking work. My hands, already calloused, blistered and bled. My muscles screamed in protest every night. But with every swing of the blade, I felt like I was clearing away more than just weeds. I was cutting down the mockery, the pity, the whispers. I was carving out a space for myself, a sanctuary where their opinions couldn't reach me. The sweat that poured off me washed away the shame. I was no longer a victim of their ridicule. I was a man with a purpose, engaged in the honest, solitary labor that had defined my entire life. One afternoon, while buying a box of nails at the hardware store, I saw a familiar face. It was Agnes Hemlock, the widow of the old stonemason who had first taught me the trade. She was a tiny woman, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She watched me at the counter, then walked over, her cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. I braced myself for another dose of pity. Instead, she put a frail, wrinkled hand on my arm. "Old man Hemlock always said your grandfather was the most stubborn man he ever knew," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Said he'd rather build something to last 1,000 years for free than build a shoddy thing for a pile of gold. Good for you, Arthur. You're your grandfather's boy." She squeezed my arm and walked away. That small gesture of validation, that one voice of understanding, felt like a cool drink of water in a desert. A few days later, I saw Mark's shiny new SUV making its way slowly up the logging road. He must have been curious to see the full extent of my foolishness up close. I was on the roof, wrestling a heavy sheet of tin into place to patch a hole, and I stopped to watch him. He didn't get out of his car. He just pulled up to the edge of the clearing I had made, rolled down his power window and stared. I could see the smirk on his face even from that distance. He looked at the collapsed porch, the sagging wall, the piles of brush. He looked at me, covered in dirt and sweat. Then he just shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound, dismissive pity, and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust. He didn't need to say a word. His message was clear. "You are pathetic." And as I watched his taillights disappear, my resolve didn't waver. It hardened into something as solid and unyielding as the stone foundation beneath me. The moment it all came to a head was simple, mundane. It happened back at the hardware store. I needed to buy some roofing tar, the smelly, black stuff you use to seal up leaks. The clerk was a young man named Billy, whose father I'd gone to school with. "What can I get for you, Arthur?" he asked, friendly enough. "A large can of roofing tar," I said. Billy grinned and turned to another customer leaning on the counter. "Putting a new roof on the palace, are we?" he asked, winking. The other man chuckled. "Gotta keep the royal termites dry," he shot back. They both laughed. A loud, easy laugh between two people sharing a joke at a third person's expense. They weren't trying to be quiet. They weren't trying to spare my feelings. They were just talking about me as if I wasn't even there. I stood there for a moment, the can of tar in my hands, and I finally understood. In their eyes, I wasn't Arthur Vance anymore. I wasn't the man who had built half the chimneys in this town, the man who had cared for his parents and his wife, the man who had lived an honest life. That man was gone. In his place was a character, a town caricature they had created. I was the old fool with the worthless property. It was a label, a box they had put me in, and it was clear I was never going to get out of it. I paid for the tar, my face a blank mask. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of that store, the sound of their fading laughter behind me, and I didn't look back. The isolation was now complete. But it wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. And I was heading back up the mountain to pull up the drawbridge. For weeks my world was reduced to the rhythm of work. The scrape of a shovel, the whine of a saw, the solid thud of a hammer. I rebuilt the porch, patched the roof, and replaced the rotten floorboards one by one. But I saved the heart of the cabin for last, the hearth. It was the only part of the structure that had stood defiant against time. A masterpiece of fieldstone, built by a man who knew his craft. I ran my hands over it every day, feeling the cool, solid strength of it. It was more than just a fireplace. It was a monument to my great-grandfather, a testament to a skill passed down through my blood. The stones were fitted so perfectly, with such care, that it felt less like construction and more like a sculpture that had been coaxed out of the earth itself. It was the only thing in that place that didn't need fixing. It was perfect. It was while I was cleaning the soot from the stones one afternoon, getting ready to finally lay a fire in it, that I saw it. It was something no one but another stonemason would ever notice. A tiny, almost invisible discrepancy. Down near the floor, one of the large foundation stones, a piece of granite weighing at least 200 pounds, was set with a mortar that was just a shade different in color and texture. The joint was perfect, seamless to a casual eye, but to me it was like a misspelled word on a perfect page. My great-grandfather would never have mixed two different batches of mortar for a single course of stone. He was too meticulous. It was a flaw, a deliberate one. It was a signal, a secret handshake across a century. My heart started to beat a little faster. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. I didn't rush. A job like this requires patience. I went back to my truck and got my smallest chisels and a mallet. For the next 3 hours I worked with the focus of a surgeon. Tap, tap, tap. A tiny chip of old mortar would fall away. Tap, tap, tap. I worked slowly, carefully, following the hairline seam around the stone. I wasn't just breaking it open, I was unsealing it, respecting the work of the man who had set it there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. By the time I felt the slightest give, the stone shifted, just a fraction of an inch, with a low grinding sound. I put my tools down, took a deep breath, and put my fingers into the groove I had made. I pulled, and the stone slid forward silently, as if it had been waiting for my touch all along. Behind it was a dark square void, a man-made cave inside the heart of the hearth. The air that came out was cold and dry, smelling of nothing but dust and time. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, and the beam landed on something that wasn't stone. It was a tin box, about the size of a shoebox, its seams sealed with thick, hardened wax. It was heavy, solid, and had an old, embossed logo of a tobacco company on the lid. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached into the space and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the floor in front of the hearth, the dust from its surface puffing up into the beam of my light. For a long moment I just stared at it, this impossible object, a secret that had been sleeping in the stone for over 100 years. Prying the lid open was a delicate task. The wax was brittle, and I didn't want to damage the box. I used my knife, slowly working my way around the edge, until I heard a faint hiss of air. The seal was broken. I lifted the lid, and the contents were revealed. There was no gold, no jewels, no pile of cash. My cousin Mark would have been disappointed. Instead, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth, were several thin, heavy steel plates, intricately engraved with patterns and portraits I vaguely recognized. Beneath them lay a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age. I picked it up, my calloused fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. A Craftsman's Ledger, 1903. This was my great-grandfather's. This was his story. That night, I didn't drive back to town. I built a small fire in the hearth, the first one in probably 50 years, and by its flickering light, I opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a man who believed in order and care, and I read. I read about his life as a stonemason, his pride in his work, and then the secret. In 1903, he had been quietly commissioned by a contact at the U.S. Mint. They feared the official engraving plates for a new series of banknotes had been compromised. He was tasked, in absolute secrecy, to create a perfect set of backup plates, a task that would be the pinnacle of his engraving skill, a craft he practiced in private. He described the long nights, the meticulous work, the strain on his eyes. It was his masterpiece. The journal told the rest of the story with a quiet, dignified bitterness. Just as he was finishing, a political scandal in Washington led to the entire banknote project being scrapped. The official who commissioned him sent a terse telegram with a single order: destroy the plates immediately and speak of this to no one. But he couldn't do it. To him, they weren't just tools. They were art. They were the best work he had ever done. Destroying them would have been like a father destroying his own child. So he disobeyed. He sealed them in the tin box, wrote down the whole truth in his ledger, and hid them in the one place he knew would stand for 1,000 years, the heart of his own hearth. It was an act of defiance, a craftsman's rebellion against a world that didn't value his work. As I finished the last page, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I looked at the steel plates glinting in the faint light. This wasn't a treasure. It was a legacy. I felt an overwhelming connection to this man I had never known, this fellow craftsman, who had faced his own kind of ridicule, his own dismissal. He had poured his soul into these plates, and the world had told him to throw them away. In that moment, I understood him completely. He had saved the best part of himself and hidden it away for someone who would understand. He hid it for me. The money, whatever it might be worth, was secondary. The real value was in that journal, in that story of quiet integrity. It was a vindication, not just for him, but for me, for a life spent believing that the quality of your work is the true measure of a man. The first thing I thought of the next morning was my cousin's. I pictured Mark's face if he knew. He wouldn't see the history, the artistry, or the act of defiance. He would see a price tag. He would see a quick and easy profit. He and Sarah would fight over it, sell it to the highest bidder without a second thought, and the story, the real legacy, would be lost forever. They would melt down my great-grandfather's masterpiece for its scrap value, if it meant an extra $1. They had proven they were not worthy of this legacy. They had laughed at the very thing that held it. And so, I made a promise to my great-grandfather. There in the quiet of the cabin, I would protect his secret. I would protect his work from the greedy hands of those who shared his blood, but not his spirit. It took me a week of quiet, careful research at the town library and a few discreet phone calls from a payphone 2 towns over to understand what I truly had. I finally got in touch with a man in Philadelphia, a renowned appraiser of historical artifacts, a man whose name was spoken with reverence in the books I read. I sent him carefully taken photographs, never revealing my name or location. He called me back a few days later, his voice hushed, electric with excitement. He said they were a piece of lost American history, a numismatic holy grail. He couldn't give me a precise figure without seeing them in person, but he said, "Son, what you have there, it's not a matter of thousands. You're looking at a 7-figure valuation, Perhaps more. Enough to buy your whole town and have plenty left over." The line went quiet. I couldn't speak. I just held the phone, my knuckles white. I hung up the phone and drove back to the cabin, the appraiser's words echoing in my head. I sat on the rebuilt porch, looking out at the mountains, and for the first time in a long time, I laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a low, deep chuckle that shook my whole body. "Kingdom of termites," Mark had said. He had stood in that lawyer's office, smug and superior, laughing at a pile of rotting wood, while standing on a mountain of treasure he was too ignorant to see. The whole town had joined in, pitying the poor old fool with his worthless inheritance. The irony was so thick, so perfect. It was almost poetic. They had judged the book by its tattered cover, while the priceless manuscript was hidden inside the binding all along. They weren't just wrong about the cabin, they were wrong about everything. They thought I was a sentimental old man, clinging to a worthless memory. And in a way they were right. I was sentimental. I did value the memory of my grandfather, the legacy of my great-grandfather. But what they saw as a weakness was actually my greatest strength. I didn't come up here looking for money. I came up here looking for something solid, something real, something that would last. I was looking for the value they couldn't see, the value in the craftsmanship, in the history. And because that's what I was looking for, that's why I was the only one who could have ever found the rest of it. The secret wasn't for a treasure hunter, it was for a stonemason. It was a reward for seeing the worth in the stone itself, not just what might be hidden behind it. In that moment, everything shifted. The humiliation that had been a constant weight on my shoulders for months just evaporated. Their opinions, their whispers, their pitying looks, it all became meaningless noise. What could Mark's condescending smirk possibly mean to me now? What power did the town's gossip have? They were all playing a small, petty game in a world I no longer inhabited. I held a truth they could never comprehend. It wasn't a feeling of arrogance or superiority. It was a feeling of profound, unshakable peace. I had been judged and found wanting by a jury of fools, but I had been vindicated by history itself, by the quiet integrity of a man who had reached across time to tell me I was on the right path. I thought about Eleanor. I could almost feel her sitting beside me on that porch, her hand in mine. She would have loved this. Not the money, but the story. She would have loved the justice of it, the quiet, perfect way things had turned out. She would have spent weeks poring over that journal, tracing the story of the man who built the hearth of the home she never got to see. And I knew what she would have wanted me to do. She wouldn't want me to buy a fancy car or a big house. She would have wanted me to use this gift, to build something, to create something that would last, something that would honor the spirit of the craftsman who made it all possible. Her memory gave me clarity. It showed me the way forward. The plan started to form in my mind, not as a scheme for revenge, but as an act of creation. The money was a tool, the most powerful tool I had ever owned. With it, I could do more than just fix this cabin. I could honor my great-grandfather's legacy in a way that would echo through the whole valley. I looked down at Stone Creek, nestled in the shadow of the mountain. The town that had mocked me, that had cast me out, they saw me as a fool, a failure. They had no idea that their salvation was going to come from the very place they despised. My work wasn't finished. In fact, it was just beginning. I wasn't just a stonemason who repaired things anymore. I was about to become a stonemason who rebuilt them. I went back inside and placed the journal and the plates back into the tin box. I sealed it carefully and slid the heavy foundation stone back into its place. The scene was just as invisible as before. The secret was safe again, sleeping in the heart of the hearth. The laughter from the town, the memory of my family's scorn, it all felt like a distant dream now. They could have their world of quick deals and easy money. I had this cabin, this mountain, this story. I was no longer Arthur Vance, the pitied old man with the worthless property. I was the keeper of a secret, the guardian of a legacy. They could keep their judgment. I had something far more valuable. I had the truth, and I was about to decide what to do with it. My final plan wasn't born from a flash of anger or a desire for revenge. It came to me slowly, over several nights spent sitting in front of that old hearth, the fire crackling and the journal resting in my lap. I thought about calling Mark, about driving my old truck down to his fancy office and throwing a bank statement on his polished desk. I imagined the look on his face, the shock, the greed, the sputtering confusion. The thought was tempting for a moment, but then I looked at the hearth, at the stones my great-grandfather had set with such care. To use his legacy as a weapon against a small man like Mark would be to dishonor it. It would make his story of integrity all about my petty victory. No, my great-grandfather's work deserved better. It deserved to be preserved, not used as a punchline in a family feud. My justice would be as silent and as solid as the stone he had worked with. The process itself was quiet and discreet. I made a few more calls from that payphone 2 towns over and arranged a meeting. I didn't sell to the highest bidder. I sold to the right one. A national historical institution in Washington, D.C., a place that understood the story, was more valuable than the steel itself. I met their curator, a quiet, respectful man with glasses, in a small law office in a city I'd never been to before. He looked at the plates with a reverence that made me know I'd made the right choice. He held the journal as if it were a sacred text. I signed the papers, he shook my hand, and I walked away. A few days later, a number appeared in a new bank account I had opened, a number so large it looked like a mistake. It didn't feel like my money. It felt like a responsibility, a tool I had been given to finish a job that had started over a century ago. First, I finished the cabin. I didn't turn it into a mansion. I restored it. I used a small portion of the money to bring it back to exactly what it was meant to be, a simple, solid shelter built to last. I hired a crew of young carpenters from the next county over, good boys who respected old wood, and I worked alongside them every day. We put on a new cedar shake roof, replaced every rotten plank with solid oak, and installed new windows that let the mountain light pour in. I kept the hearth exactly as it was, the untouched heart of the home. When it was done, I moved in. I spend my evenings on the porch, watching the deer in the clearing, and my nights by the fire, in a silence that is no longer lonely, but peaceful. This is my kingdom. Not of termites, but of stone and wood and quiet dignity. It's all I ever really wanted. Then, I turned my attention to the town. Stone Creek was dying a slow death, its history crumbling. So I set up a trust, an anonymous one. The first project was the old town library, a beautiful stone building where Eleanor and I used to spend rainy afternoons. It had been closed for years due to a leaky roof and a cracked foundation. The trust paid for its complete restoration. I'd drive into town for supplies and hear people talking about the mysterious benefactor. One morning I saw Mark at the diner, holding court. "It's got to be some billionaire from the city," he said loudly. "Looking for a tax shelter. Good for us, I guess." He took a sip of his coffee, smug as ever, completely unaware that the money saving his town's soul came from the pile of sticks he'd laughed at. That quiet moment, seeing him so certain and so wrong, was a better justice than any argument I could have ever won. In the end, my family and the town taught me a valuable lesson. They look at the world and only see the surface. The rotting wood, the sagging roof, the poor old man. They see value in dollars and cents, in things that can be bought and sold and bragged about. They laughed at me because I saw something different. I saw the craftsmanship. I saw the history. I saw the legacy of a man who believed in building things to last, and because I valued that, I was given the rest. My silence isn't weakness, it's my strength. It's the final word in an argument they don't even know we had. They can have their world of noise and judgment. I'll stay up here on my mountain, in the house they called worthless, rich in ways they will never, ever understand. They thought my inheritance was a joke, but it turned out to be the foundation for everything.